Once upon a time, in a place not so far away from where you might be thinking. No, not there, though you wouldn't be entirely wrong. This was a place known as Hesperia. Not too many people could travel the land without knowing about it, as it was one of the most popular destinations for both recreational and live-in situations. In other words, it was the most popular, most amazing, and probably the best place in the whole of the world. You see, not only its style and atmosphere were incredible, but its technology and quality of life was immensely superior to those around it. Of course, it didn't go without its problems. There was quite a few difficulties in people being able to even think about living there. Not only was it somewhat expensive, but it was incredibly hard to get citizenship. But still people dreamed, and the world went on. One such soul that dreamed of going there was a certain boy outcast from his family. He was a noble from a far-off country in the distant north, a place where the snow fell no matter what. There was not a time that he could remember that the snow did not cover the ground, if there was a ground beneath it at all. It was a place filled with many caves, mountains, ravines, and frozen rivers, where water flowed even still, defying the cold and majesty of the far north. The kingdom was that of Hesperia. It was known for its distribution of both power and wealth among the nobles, an export of gold and rare metals, sustaining them. But strife was quick at hand, as the quality of life from the growing cold stifled them. Many nobles left for lands unknown, or even those of the far south in Saba, the land of deserts and oceans. But Hesperia was a little-known place among the many fields and ravines leading between the two, far to the east. Its temperate nature left it at the perfect crossroads of both fresh water and ocean, its exports being mostly entertainment, as well as its tendency to make trade deals with those around it. Economics aside, this boy from the far north had known a truly tragic past. His family, led by an abusive father who wanted him to be everything he wasn't. He had ran away from home, the heir to the throne, a future king who wanted nothing with such a cold and terrible place. For all his life, he had known espionage, his life being dangled on a string. People with false smiles and fake intent. His trust had been wounded from an early age, and he still struggled to see anyone as naught but predators. And though it took him long, painful, and terrible journey south, his stolen goods, money, and, well, his intent refused to give up. He had heard a rumor, you see, that there was places where people were not treated by how much power they owned or how strong they were, but instead as equals, a place where he could find a new home despite his lineage, despite his puppet strings leading him ever back to the frozen throne. Yet still he dreamed not only of the warmth in his heart, but a place where no snow falls year long, but instead a place with warmth, caring people, that perhaps even despite what he was, the differences between him and them, for he was not human. Instead, he was of a hated race, a wretched one, or as some know, a demon, the demon's crown prince. Still a boy at heart, but a man in truth. He had fled, taking everything he could, because he knew if he stayed, there was nothing but bloodshed, hatred, cold and putrid intense. While it may have seemed a bit rushed, abrasive, after all his people needed him, and yet still he could find no reason. They would not listen. He would just remain a puppet to a council above him. Instead, his journey south, despite his struggles, it did get warmer. And thanks to his efforts, he had even hid his lineage. In a very desperate attempt, he had broken his horns off, filed them down along the way, tried to pass as human, showing as little as he could of his impurities by their standards. After all, living as a wretch in a human territory must be leagues better than living as royal with the demons, at least given his lack of support. You see, there was a duality to it. He was going to end up the crown prince, of course, but the reasoning was not a kind one. There was a strife between his two elder brothers, and they had ended in a war, killing each other off in the process. A daring standstill meant he was to collect all of their glory, and yet the disdain for a weak king. He was always mortified by the expectations of him being a warrior, when what he truly loved was books. Things that could bring him to a warmer place, stories and information, places he could visit, even within the confines of the royal castle. It was not a perfect escape, but it was the only one he knew. And if not for a kind librarian, he would have never made it this far. After all, the books he loved so much had taught him his way. Not only his survival, but the human language, a key that he needed to polish before going further. As he would stay at inn here or there, he picked up on little intricacies within the language, not only the accents but the inflections. It was key that he made them perfect. Otherwise, he would surely be outed, taken as a slave, or killed on the spot. He had read those stories and known exactly what befalls demons who get caught. With that drive, he wanted to see if what he had heard was true. After all, in a certain book was where he drove his rumor of hope for a life better in the South. There was a place that seemed to accept demon, human, and elf alike. Even if the rumors were to be believed, dragons, undead, almost anything could find solace in the lands of Hesperia. It was a paradise on this planet, a place in which he could only see from the outside, at least as it stood. There was so much in between the plan A and B that he couldn't quite make out what the next step was. You see, he was within eyeshot of it at this point. And yet, from all his studying, it was such an unprecedented monster of information. The unknown. He knew economics, but he didn't know what would get him in. Only a vague understanding of what could potentially be his way in. Running low on coin and supplies, there was little more he could do. But then, the change he had been hoping for happened. There seemed to be some kind of a raffling event for a citizenship, multiple at that. It was something that was apparently tied to a year-long festival. Well, at least that's what he gathered from the posters. Thankfully, it seemed it was a sort of contest of sorts. He was to participate in a tournament of arms, place within the top 10, and he secured himself a place within the kingdom's citizenship. He was delighted with the potential, but also worried because there would likely be many strong opponents. His intent was clear, but he was never one for violence, taking much more to those of the arcane knowledge and knowledge in general. While he was a capable mage of both fire and ice, he did not like the process of actual fighting. It was why he was considered the coward prince, the youngest naive one who was not really a demon at all, but a failure. He resented it. To a certain extent, he wanted to be what they wanted him to, the strong, fearless leader that they expected. And yet, he never had a passion for that. Perhaps now he wished he had. if only because his citizenship, his dreams of a future, relied upon it. He steadfastly made his way to registration and found himself whisked away to a waiting room. It was cold and damp, as must be expected of a waiting room before a potentially dangerous bout. With bars on the window, it looked far more like a prison than it did a holding room. As he heard the names called, as time slowed past, he soon was up for his very first match. And, to his surprise, he saw quite a magnificent display of gleaming armor. Someone who looked as graceful as they did beautiful. A strange but enamoring knight. You see, this knight must have been something big in some far-off country, but he couldn't think about that right now. The fiery-tempered fellow seemed to be full of himself from the very start, but he could not allow his weakness to show. He would have to intimidate as much as he would win, as to not allow his chance to meet folly. And as the match began, as soon as the starting bells rung, it had ended. Without a second passed. His ice had crept up, putting an icicle at his throat, the knight's only unprotected place. It did not stab him, but merely forced him to meekly admit defeat. All of the fire in his heart met the cool-headed attempt at winning without any conflict at all. And he continued to his next match. It seemed to be relentless. One after the other. He would do the same thing, but times were more difficult with each coming opponent. And through much toils and troubles, he found himself in the semifinals, to which there was someone favored to win, if the murmuring of other contestants was to be believed. This gentleman, or was it a woman? He couldn't tell, but they were magnificently clothed in a way that denied him of understanding. But all he could tell was they were likely very beautiful, perhaps even gorgeous. And no matter what they were, he could not let his guard down, as they were called the Rose of the Desert, which was a play on words, he come to find out. They were like an oasis, both in skill and attitude. Someone who would fight with a smile to the bitter end. Once again the chimes struck, and the match was off. He attempted as usual, but they quickly dodged to the side, taking note of the fact his ice could not follow as fast. They closed the distance. With the blade drawn, the match was nearly at an end straight from the beginning, almost the opposite as he had done. But he managed to procure ice on his hand and blocked a swing from their gleaming blade. And after a moment, he caught himself. He launched fire in a wall in attempts to create distance. They cut right through it with their daring blade. Before long, in a blink of an eye, their sword was at his throat, but he was smiling. After all, it was the semifinals. He didn't have to win. But they smiled, mischievously. He thought they must have been smiling because it was their victory, but instead, they plunged their sword back into its sheath and offered a hand. He had fallen down clumsily in an attempt to avoid their blow, but left himself at their mercy. It was potentially to the death, but they spared him, instead offering a congratulations that he was a fair opponent and that they nearly lost themselves, and instead shared a sweet moment that he could never forget. After all, it was the first display of kindness anyone had ever shown him. Well, not the first. There was the librarian, but this was different. It did feel warmer. As he contemplated taking the hand, he eventually succumbed to his desire to know if it was true or not. Wincing, he grabbed their hand, expecting them to do something terrible, but instead, they held his hand up high and said that truly there was no winner or loser here. That while they attained victory, he had fought strongly. Their voice was silky, almost like a warm embrace. And he was quite addicted for someone who had just met them. A new feeling welled up in his chest, but he couldn't place it. The gallant and wonderful warrior who had beaten him soundly now threatened him with new feelings and a smile on his face. As he exited the arena, they chased after him, curious to know his name. As he explained, his name was Shoto, not daring to mention his last name as it was associated with the demons. It was a sly defense, but not one that would work against certain people. But as long as they weren't royalty, surely they wouldn't know. For a moment he thought he had blundered, their expression looking blank, almost entranced. He expected them to draw their sword, but perhaps it was just his anxiety, what he expected of those around him. Yet the reality of it was so different. Instead, they gave a big smile and said it was a fine name. It was the first time, once again, this person had stolen his firsts. And when he asked their name, he found out it was a name that he'd expect for someone so amazing. But it sounded foreign, so he didn't quite know how to say it. despite its simplicity. It was the most wonderful name he had ever heard. And as he got his paperwork for the victory, his heart nearly came out of his chest. He thought he would stand still and become dead right then and there, as if a curse had been placed on him. He saw the person in a mix of happiness and fear. There was the one who had beaten him, standing right beside the highest point of the kingdom. This meant they were royalty, and no doubt know that he was a demon. He panicked. Of course, that pause, the pause they had when he said his name. He should have made a new name. He lamented that fact. And yet, there were no guards hunting him, no mercenaries at his throat. What could it mean? He couldn't place it. Clearly they knew, but there must have been some reason they hadn't caught him yet. He contemplated leaving, but something kept him there. Perhaps it was just a morbid curiosity, or maybe it was a belief in their smile. But for better or worse, he accepted his reward and was accepted in Hesperia. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling, walking the streets for the first time. While he didn't have enough to buy anything of worth, it certainly was a beautiful, clean, and glorious place with things he'd only dreamed of back in the demon capital. It was breathtaking, enamoring, one of the most beautiful sights he had ever seen. Just seeing the smiles, happiness instead of cold brutality. Instead of strength, he saw weakness in its most beautiful form. In safety, there was no need to be a cold-hearted, strong pillar of strength. Instead, he could be weak without being shameful. He was confident in his knowledge that he could do something for someone to find his place in the kingdom, but he wasn't sure what to do about the heir to the throne, who he had unwittingly told his name and his origin. It was only a matter of time, wasn't it? So he thought, there's only one thing to do. One thing that he respected, even with his father's abuse, was his teachings to always face one's fate with honor, dignity, and at its core. Despite his father never living up to these words, at least the concept was sound. He would face his fate head on. And so he made his way to the castle, requesting the heir to the throne. Of course, he was denied at first, but he waited. He stayed outside those gates until near collapsing, before being allowed his summons. And then he saw his fate there beside the throne. It was a very different kind of throne than he was used to. It was warm and didn't feel at all hostile, and yet it was imposing, clearly royalty. but he still remained strong. There they were, his life's benefactor, sitting there with a big smile as if the match had just ended. He asked them desperately, what was it they wanted with him? They must have known he was a demon royal at that. Surely they must be planning to use him as a bargaining chip in some war. But none of their gestures or precautions signified that. Was it confidence? Confidence that he was no more a threat than a gnat caught in a spider's web? He couldn't place it. But then, as the silence was broken, they said they had no intention of worrying about that. His past was his own, and he had come here alone. That his eyes, there was no trace of discontent, and that he could have killed if he truly were like the demons of rumors. Why didn't he kill the opponents he was freely allowed to? His nature caused him to fall to his knees, because it was so openly said that he was a demon. He got a horrible sense of fear, and yet the warmth of the voice remained. There was no shred of judgment, no shred of hatred, all the things he was so used to. And yet, he couldn't help but quiver and shake, worried till the last word sung. But instead of a cruel sentence, they asked if he would join them for tea, something he was vaguely familiar with in an ironic revelation. Of course he nodded, but it was so distant, so surreal, just like when he walked the streets. And as he walked to the all-too-regal tower that overlooked the entire kingdom, it was open air with a table that overlooked everything. Birds made their home all around it, but it didn't seem unkempt. And the tea smelled lovely, with dried fruits and what seemed to be rose petals. It was the epitome of elegance. The heir to the throne spoke. This time, asking him curious questions about what he felt, what he thought of the kingdom, and what he was here for. He answered honestly, because for better or worse, he couldn't find any reason to tell any half-truths or lies. He was sick and tired of those. He explained that he came here out of passion to find like-minded people, a warmer kingdom, a place that could see that life was more than power, life was more than passion for glory. It was passion for softer things, more gentler ones, that his scar was not just one for show, but one of a lesson he never wanted anyone else to have to learn. He explained that he heard of this kingdom in a book he read, that he dreamed of calling it his own, because he saw it as a lighthouse among the foggy emptiness of his life, a place where he could dream and read his books, maybe write some of his own story, where he didn't have to kill or be killed. Perhaps it was by chance, or perhaps first love. The air smiled, but looked a bit stunned at his words, as if he had just said the most unbelievable thing they'd ever heard. And yet, the smile was as warm as ever. As he sipped the tea and waited for a response, they asked him if he would mind coming here again. Strangely, it seemed they had taken to him. He wasn't sure why they would associate with a demon of all things, but he certainly wasn't opposed to it. And as things progressed day after day, he kept coming to that tower and having tea parties. Sometimes it was just the crown and he. Other times, there were guests, which he assumed, and would later find out, were relatives of the heir to the crown. But through many a riffing and vast conversations, they talked of stories and books and all kinds, and found commonplace. Before long, the intimidation faded, and he tried to explain that another feeling had taken its place, but he didn't know what to call it. His notebooks he had ever read contained knowledge on this feeling. Love, they said. He stared blankly, repeating it as if he was a puppet. Love. What is that? And just like a flower coming into full bloom, they smiled and said, "It's what I fell into as I've grown to know you." And in that moment he was unsure of how to place it. He was stunned, and so much so that he ended up dropping the expensive-looking tea kettle. It was a big shattering emphasis. It even burned him and the one who he cherished, and he felt terrible, worried even. He apologized, but said, "I do not know, but I feel, if nothing else in this world, that I want to have more of these moments with you. I want to be with you always." And of course, he did what he could to heal the burns, and luckily they weren't too bad, and they laughed it off together. And in a strange, surreal emphasis, he began to be by their side. Certain things of his past he never got used to. The differences being so much, he would constantly ask silly questions which made them laugh. Like what a spoon was, or what the purpose of vegetables are. He learned so many different things, and the two were quite an amazing royal couple. And just like that, he had become a second to a kingdom he always dreamed of. In a strange, whimsical play of fate, he was not killed or eaten as the scary rumors would have him believe. Instead, he was proudly accepted for what he was by both his love and Hesperia. And it's said that the two became the happiest royals that ever lived, and Hesperia entered into an eternal, happy era, a place beyond dreams. And luckily, due to both of their unique heritages, they live on to this day, happily in each other's arms. Though they stepped down from being the true rulers, leaving that to their children. And it's said that they tour the world, and you can find them whenever you're struggling. But that's a story for another day, and one I'm sure you'll hear soon.